Our Elbit Out campaign video was narrated by a refugee woman from Gaza who had managed to escape the violence at the time, and her experience stands at the core of our campaign and what we're trying to achieve. I'm Alex. I'm your moderator for the day. I'm part of the Palestinian Solidarity Cluj-Napoca collective and also collaborating the Elbit Out campaign. The panel today is about alternative visions for peace and security, and about rethinking security beyond militarised frameworks. My experience, my professional experience, plays a lot into this. I'm a political criminologist, and for the past 13 years I've been researching state crimes, and in particular atrocity crimes. And in doing so, I've looked very closely at how the very institutions who claim to provide security are in fact committing violence against all living things, from human beings to the environment. This perspective, and this professional perspective, is very much at the heart of today's discussion, because once we actually begin to interrogate how security is defined and how security is operationalized by the state apparatus, it becomes very clear that militarized approaches often obscure more than they reveal. At its core, the conversations that we're going to be having in today's panel ask us to question something that is often taken for granted, the idea that security is best achieved through military power. Too often, public discourse and policy frameworks remain anchored in this deterrence, in armament, in force projection, and in doing so, they very much marginalise the importance of social, economic, and environmental conditions that far more fundamentally shape the realities of people's safety. So, what we're going to be doing today is we're going to anchor our discussion around safety in the concept of human security, which is essentially a people-centered understanding of a peace that is grounded in rights, in dignity, in exploitation, and in ecological stability. We're going to be exploring how militarized paradigms are essentially reproducing insecurity, and most importantly, we're going to be opening up the space for alternative visions, ones in which peace is not built through force, but through justice, through redistribution, and through sustainable systems that prioritize human life. It's now my pleasure to introduce our speakers. First, we have Annachiara Canetta. She's the Europe organizer for War Beyond War, which is a global movement committed to the abolition of war. She's a researcher and an activist engaged in anti-war, Palestine solidarity, and food sovereignty movements. And her work is very deeply invested in essentially building connections across strugglers, showing how the war system systematically diverts resources away from environmental and social justice. In her role with War Beyond War, she supports local chapters and works extensively on coalition building across Europe. We also are joined by Gavin, who is a sociologist originally from the UK, but based in Poland for the past 3 decades. His work focuses on politics, society, and economic transformations in Central and Eastern Europe, and he's a founding member of the think tank Forward, which essentially contributes to broader debates within Transform Europe. His research offers critical insight into how these political and economic structures actually shape contemporary understandings of society. And finally, we are joined by our very own Vlad, who is a coordinator of the Elbit Out campaign and after which we are going to have respect to asking your questions. Please do wait until all speakers have had time to for their interventions, and then if you just raise your hand, one of my colleagues is going to bring you a microphone. Thank you so much. I think we're ready to start.
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me. It's really a pleasure to be here among all these amazing speakers on this weekend. As Alex said, I work for War Beyond War, which is a grassroots organization focusing on the abolition of war. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what this approach means and what abolition means, especially in the context of the war system. So, the idea of abolition is that we do not only want to dismantle the war system, but we also want to create an alternative to it. So envision an alternative where militarized violence does not exist, and envision a world where war does not exist. And this can be very difficult to imagine. When we talk about abolition, we sometimes talk about the abolition of borders, the abolition of prison, or the abolition of the police. And the same thing for war. It's very difficult to imagine life without these systems because they're so deeply embedded in our life and in our societies. But we also know that the systems are systems of oppression that are very harmful for a large majority of the population, while they are promoted and want to be like they're continued by a small majority that profits off from them. We also know that this system of oppression are interlinked. Borders, police, all of this violence are connected with one another. So it's really important that we see this connection and that we realize that for them to exist, to abolish them, we have to see them as a system. So this is really important that we focus on abolishing them, on dismantling the systems, but also on practice like building communities, alternative communities that are based on care and solidarity and on hope. As I said, it is difficult to do this, but when we talk about abolition, an example that has been very useful for me also in understanding how this can work has been the abolition of slavery. So slavery was an institution which existed until 200 years ago. But now it's been abolished. And this doesn't mean that it doesn't exist anymore at all. This doesn't mean that slavery is... There are still some form of slavery, but it is generally seen as something morally wrong and illegal. And this shows that these systems can be abolished and can be ended. And it's very important that we remember this. Why it is important to challenge war from an abolitionist perspective? So, war is often portrayed as something that just happens. Government just say, oh, we need to do this is just happening. And just like a crisis, an emergency that we have to respond to. But we know this is not true, that war is prepared, that our governments are investing billions of euros in the preparation for war. We know this is not the case, so seeing war as a system, as an institution is also very important. It's important that we challenge war that is happening at the moment, like we're doing with Gaza, like we're doing with Iran. It's important that we oppose this war, but we really have to take a step back also and see it as a system and tackle it like in a whole way, in a holistic way. Also when we talk about abolition, it can feel very daunting, but it can feel like something like very big. How do we do this? And that's also through the work of the organization that I'm part of, as I say, is a grassroots organization. We try to identify which way, like practical steps in which we can move toward the abolition of war, yeah, we can all take practical steps that move us toward the abolition of the system of war and also to envisioning alternatives to it. So there are some concrete ways to dismantle the war system that we've been talking about in these days for sure. And we normally identify three main areas. The first one is getting rid of the physical infrastructure of war. So this means stopping the arms trade. So what we've been talking about the whole weekend. Stopping the arms trades, closing bases, not allowing new bases to be built, stopping also research toward the development of new weapons, abolishing nuclear weapons. So these are all steps that at a grassroots level we can take through direct action, and yeah, feels also that does feel like a big thing, but we have seen that these things like they are possible. Secondly, moving the money away from the war industry, so divestment. It was also mentioned yesterday. For example, our comrades and colleagues in Canada have been working for different years in getting Scotiabank to divest from Elbit system. And this was done through pressure to the bank, through like mass closing of accounts, also protests at the branches of the bank, and pressure also from artists where Scotiabank was involved in like artistic projects. And this led Scotiabank to divest from Elbit system, and it was the main international shareholders of Elbit system. So this is a very important victory that we have to focus on and remember. And lastly, the third step is taking away the bodies from the enable war. So war cannot happen without the involvement of everyday people. And this like consensus objection is an alternative that we have, and this is becoming increasingly important, especially in Europe, where there's more and more talks about the draft, and countries are introducing the draft, the military draft. So yeah, it's knowing that consensus objection is an alternative, is a possibility, and that we can, it's also human rights protected by Human Rights Convention at UN level and also at like national levels. So basically realizing this option, letting especially young people know that they have an alternative, that they can say no to war and say no to entering the armies. This is also very important. And this kind of also leads me to building up the alternative. So how can we, as activists, how can we keep each other safe? How do we keep each other safe when conflict arises? And we have to accept that conflict is always going to come up, but how do we respond to this in a way that is not violent and that is not militarized? There are different approaches to this, and one thing we've been promoting is unarmed civilian defense. Unarmed civilian defense can take different forms. For example, when there is a military intervention, a military invasion of a country, there can be total refusal strike from workers that make the invasion less interesting for the country that's going to do it. So this is an option. But one approach that we also I really believe in is protective presence. Protective presence, or also it's called solidarity work, is when the idea that international people that can enter an area of conflict where there is conflict between two communities, and it's proven and it's seen that having internationals and having this kind of civilians trained to de-escalate conflicts. This is done it's already for many years. It's also my personal experience in the West Bank, where this has been done by the International Solidarity Movement and also many other organizations, where Palestinians are calling on international to join and to accompanying people that are more at risk of violence, especially from settlers and from the army. So this is mostly farmers, people that live close to the settlements. And like, as I said, Palestinian are calling these people, of course, it's not, we have to avoid in this case, and of course always, but like a white saviorist approach. It's very important of being aware that it's a way for us and to use our white privilege and our passport privilege that allows us to enter into the West Bank, and using this privilege to protect Palestinians and to be in solidarity with Palestinians. And as while doing this, people working with providing protective presence are not only they are witnesses, they can witness what is happening, the violence that is happening, and amplify the voices of Palestinians. Again, unfortunately, we know that it's often the case where when Palestinians speak up about the violence, there are less heard, while we can use, again, our privilege to counter this and amplify the voices. But it can also, for example, in the case of farmers, it can also is a way of helping them, supporting them, and providing physical labor. This often happens during the olive harvest, which is a very important moment for Palestinians, and that's also when a lot of the attacks from settlers and the army happen. So yeah, these are some examples of what can be done. Another example that is quite well known now about civilian defense of the flotillas. So groups of people that do not only trying to bring aid into Gaza, but also go in there to witness what was happening and try to rebuild and support the Palestinians on the ground. These are some examples of what can be done, but the core of abolition is the idea that we build these communities and these different societies together. So of course, it really is different. There is not one solution that is going to work for every case, and it's really a big part of abolition is building these futures together, the structures together, in care and solidarity, listening to each other, and supporting each other.
Thank you so very much for having provided the insights. I think it's very common that we hear in generally speaking political rhetoric that there is no alternative to military security, that there is no alternative to militarization, that this is something that needs to be done, and not just that, but that those who support abolitionism or that transition towards human security are idealists. They dream of an utopic world, and it's just unrealistic. So thank you very much for that insight. I'm sure we're going to have lots of questions from the general public, so we're going to be exploring that a little bit later. Gavin, if you're ready. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation to the organisers. When I heard that this was the first anti-war event or conference in Romania since 1990, then it's a real great privilege to be here. As we know, we're probably living in the most dangerous period in the world since the beginning of the Second World War. We're living in a period of increasing and intensifying wars, conflicts, militarisation, the rise of fascism. Of course, I don't need to remind people about this. We've talked about this all weekend, from the genocide in Gaza to the assault on Iran, Lebanon, Cuba, Venezuela. And what I want to talk about is Europe, in particular this part of Europe, in Central and Eastern Europe. So from where I'm coming from, Poland, and being here in Romania, that for all the drive towards militarisation in Europe at the moment, that this will most directly affect this region of Europe, and if an anti-war and anti-militarist movement is to grow and develop in Europe and be successful, it has to be built here, because from the very fundamental point that this part of Europe is in the most danger if war in Europe escalates. So we have the largest war in Europe since the Second World War. We don't know the numbers of casualties exactly because both sides don't reveal the figures, but we know that it's in the hundreds of thousands of people who have died in the Ukrainian war since 2022. It's brought huge material destruction to Ukraine. Millions of people are displaced, and billions of euros have been spent or have been wasted upon weapons of destruction which are killing people in that country. This threatens the peace and security of Europe, and it also threatens to destroy or to weaken the economies and the welfare states of Europe, which have been built up since the end of the Second World War. What this war has shown is that the European leaders, political leaders, it's shown the weakness of European political leaders, it's shown the ineptness of European leaders, and it's shown how the European political class is reliant and dependent upon the United States. They fail to act independently in the interests of Europe and the interests of their own populations. They have no political strategy to try to end the war and try to bring peace to the continent, and this is the most urgent task facing the peace movement in Europe today. How can we bring peace in Europe, and how can we prevent the escalation of this war from engulfing Europe as it has done in the past? As I said, this particularly affects Central and Eastern Europe. The invasion of Ukraine by Russia was morally, legally, and politically wrong. But it didn't happen in a vacuum. It began after the expansion of NATO into Central and Eastern Europe and all the other events of moving the European and NATO military eastwards. And it seems that the European political class shares the same strategy as the leadership in the United States, both before and after the election of Trump, which is to keep this war going. To keep the war going with the aim of weakening Russia to the point that they can instigate a regime change there. To isolate China, which is the primary goal of all of the foreign policy of the United States at the moment, and to make Europe further dependent upon the United States, for example, through cutting off energy supplies to the east and making European countries dependent upon the import of liquid gas, etc., from the United States. So the war in Ukraine directly threatens the security and peace of this region, of Central and Eastern Europe. We are on the front line of this war, and this is nothing new. If you remember, NATO expanded into Central Eastern Europe in 1999 when it brought in Hungary, Poland, and the Czech Republic. 12 days later, they started the bombing of Yugoslavia. Yesterday was the anniversary of when NATO bombed the Chinese embassies in Belgrade. In 2003, in the run-up to the war in Iraq, the USA declared that this part of the world is New Europe, not Old Europe, thus placing a divide in the centre of the continent, and it was declared New Europe because the governments in countries such as Romania and Poland supported the illegal invasion of Iraq in 2003. Remember, these governments at this time were social democratic, centre-left governments, both in Poland and Romania. And of course both countries were rewarded with the situation of so-called black sites in Poland and Romania, where you had the presence of secret prisons which interrogated and even tortured prisoners illegally on Polish and Romanian soil. And then to the war in Ukraine. Many in the West, and including from the left, have claimed that this war is a defence not just of the people of Ukraine, but the people of the whole of Central and Eastern Europe. Many have argued that we should listen to the people of Eastern Europe and people in Poland, Romania and so forth, and act accordingly, which means more militarisation, sending more weapons to Ukraine, and supporting the war until Russia is defeated, whatever exactly this means by Russia being defeated. Because if it ever came to this point, then I think, as people envisage it, then we're essentially facing the threat of nuclear war. And certainly in this part of the world, the urgency and the seriousness of the war in Ukraine is felt. I mean, from my own experience, I remember when the war broke out in 2022, seeing the huge numbers of Ukrainian refugees coming into Warsaw and being looked after and put up by the Polish population that reacted in a humanitarian manner to this event. I also remember Joe Biden turning up in Warsaw and declaring it as a new front and declaring that they will be supporting and continuing the war in Ukraine. I remember and I see how refugees from Africa and the Middle East were not treated with the care which is afforded to the migrants from Ukraine, and how many of them, we don't know the numbers again, if figures I've seen was around 130, could be many more, of refugees from Africa, the Middle East, who were frozen in the forest on the border, the Belarusian-Polish border. We've seen as Poland has increased at an unprecedented scale the level of militarisation. It now, in the last year, has spent almost 5% of its GDP on the military. In 2024-25, it was estimated to be around $38 billion. Defence expenditures from 2025 to 2035 are estimated in Poland to reach around $450 billion. We now see that Poland is going to be the largest recipient of the loans, i.e. will be going into debt to receive from in the SAFE programme. Poland is the first, the second is Romania, putting the countries of this region further into debt to build up their militaries and to place them in the front line of any future conflict. When we talk about welfare, not warfare, it's not just national budgets, it's also European money. There's lots to be criticised of the European Union, but the inflow of structure and cohesion funds from the European Union to countries like Poland has helped it to build up some of its infrastructure and so forth. This is coming to an end. What now it is, it's going to be into debt to buy weapons from the military industries in the United States, South Korea, and maybe the one difference will increasingly start to buy it from Germany. So when people start talking about we should listen to the populations in Eastern Europe, what do the populations in Eastern Europe actually think? Well, it's divided, because again the stereotype is normally to place this part of the world into one group. So for example, whilst the populations of Estonia, 61% support sending more military to Ukraine, in Hungary this 74% oppose it. And many of the countries are in between. In fact, if you see the countries which are most supportive of continuing this war and funding Ukraine, they tend to be from Western Europe rather than from Central Eastern Europe. The political leaders which have stood up the most against this war, and these are not people who tend to be friends of politically for most people in this room, are people from Hungary, Slovakia and other countries who see what the threat is of the escalation of this war. What about Poland, a country which is placed as being one of the most vehement supporters of the NATO policy in Ukraine? Well, 54% of polls in the recent polls show that they now favour negotiations to end this conflict, even if it means territorial concessions from Kiev. Only 28% support continuing the war without any compromise. Nearly 2/3 oppose sending Polish troops to Ukraine. Unlike in France or the UK, no mainstream political leader in Poland ever raises the prospect of sending Polish troops to Ukraine because the war is not some story on the other side of the continent. It's something which is real and occurring next door. Unfortunately, the only political force in Poland which is actually talking about this tends to be from the far right. They mix it up with right-wing, nationalist, anti-migrant sentiments. You have an increasingly growing hostile attitude towards Ukrainians in the country at the moment, which is being fueled by the leaders of the far right. So, what can happen in the war with Ukraine? Coming back again, despite his rhetoric, I don't think that Donald Trump has any interest in ending this war. I think that the strategy of the United States at the moment is to place the financial and military burden of the war over to the European leaders. There's a new division of labour within the NATO alliances at the moment. Europe, you take the burden here. This is your war. You carry it on. Buy our weapons, by the way, but carry on the war here, and we will be concentrating on the conflicts in Iran, possibly to China, etc., etc. For the anti-war movement, although the situation can seem very difficult and dire at times, I think a number of opportunities are increasingly going to open up, including in this part of Europe. First of all, it's simply around the growing realisation of the threat of war and how this war could expand, and therefore the building upon that basic emotion that there should be peace and security and not war. Secondly, connected to this, is the growing demand within European countries that there should be a draft of young people to join the army. We can already see in Germany where they're trying this. There's a beginnings of the social movement of young people not to join the army, to go against this. I think this, if it is tried in other countries, has a very great potential to mobilise young people. And added to this, we should oppose any attempt to send young Ukrainian men back to the front to fight this war, as some politicians in European NATO countries are now talking about. And finally, the economic costs of the war. The strategy of the European ruling class is to do exactly what Trump and USA want. They do all this sort of laugh at Donald Trump and claim that we can't trust the USA anymore, etc., but they do exactly what Donald Trump asks, which is for European countries to raise their military spending and to build their militaries. This is not an anti-Trumpian position, it's a pro-Trumpian position. Trump asks them to do it, and they respond accordingly. This will inevitably result in cuts in other social and welfare spending. And we have, it was talked about yesterday in one of the panels, this idea of military Keynesianism, this idea that European countries can re-industrialise and revive their economies through increasing military spending. Military spending can have some limited effect, simply but you're putting money into the economy. It can have some form of growth in industrial work, but it's very limited. It's limited because the investments are wasteful, they are non-productive, and the most that you can hope for is that these weapons will rust and rot in the warehouses and not actually be used to cause human and physical destruction. It's also limited in this part of the world, particularly because it's a form of dependent militarism, whereby the majority of the military hardware and weapons are being bought from the military industries which are elsewhere. In Poland, for example, the current military spending, something like 80%, has been spent from weapons procured from primarily South Korea and the USA. And we come back, maybe I'll finish by coming back to a historical figure of the Polish left and German left, which was Rosa Luxemburg. And Rosa Luxemburg was one of the first to write about how war is a form of regression into barbarianism. And this is what we face today. And somebody that was born in Poland and lived and was an activist and a revolutionary in Germany, I wonder what it's like when you look across the border and you see the German ruling class talking about how they are planning to build the largest army in Europe by 2039. 2039. They have no shame. On Victory Day, they talk about building the largest army in Europe by 2039. This is regression into barbarianism. This is the kind of militarism that leads to war, genocide, and it must be stopped.
Thank you so much, Gavin. I think we can all agree that it was very useful to bring to the forefront those discussions about the kinds of power plays that take place across different dimensions of this movement towards further militarization, from the interactions between our respective political leaders and world leaders to the protections we are offering to some victims more than others. Thank you so much for that. Vlad?
Thank you so much. To kind of round up the discussion, I would like to put it into context. Also our campaign and also why we believe it's important to have this kind of discussion here, because we are not just talking about Palestine now, we're not just talking about Gaza. This is a wider discussion. And I think it's also important to understand the importance of Gaza and what happened in Gaza and in the West Bank and Lebanon for the anti-war movement here in Europe. I think now, without a doubt, it's very clear that the Gaza genocide has been a world event. We have seen solidarity movements literally in almost every country around the globe, at least in the countries that are complicit in some way or another in the genocide. And it wasn't that the Gaza genocide opened the eyes of the world to the atrocities Israel has committed, but they opened the eyes to a world system which is unequal and unjust. So I think, to put it into historical perspective, especially for the European world and the Western world, I think the Gaza genocide was kind of similar to the 2008 economic crisis, in the sense that it kind of ended the consensus, like the 2008 crisis ended the consensus around the end of history and opened up this space for a critique of capitalism. I think now the Gaza genocide has actually opened the space for a critique of this world system, which I think can very accurately be described as an imperialist world system, which is divided between the global north, with its center in the US and its satellites all over the world, including in Israel, of course, and the global majority, which is the global south, which is systematically subjected to violence from the global north. So when we talk about militarism and alternatives to militarism, such as human security, I think we need to have this discussion in this kind of framework and understand that this is an international problem that manifests itself differently in the center compared to the south. So I think we're now at a point, as most of the speakers also highlighted yesterday, where we see this kind of increased pressure to militarize, to invest into military spending, and it is being framed as a kind of response to the Ukrainian war. But I think if we look a bit back, was actually one of the demands that Trump was making during his first go at the presidency. So this is not new, and we see now that the context is right, that the Americans actually managed to push this narrative that everybody needs to invest 5% of GDP into the military, but it's not based on any kind of subjective analysis. Like this, there's no analysis, nobody actually knows why we need to spend 5% on GDP on the military. The only reason is that the US is doing this, and we need to do the same as the US to be equal partners within NATO. So it's important to mention that there is, especially in the center and the periphery, there is this class dimension to it. Militarization usually comes with a very big cost, even though, yes, as Gavin mentioned, they can have beneficial economic effects on the short term. I think on the long term, it's quite clear that the impact on the general population of moving these resources from social resources to very unproductive. And unproductive is the best case scenario, because unproductive means that we are not using the weapons. When this sector becomes productive, then it's even worse news for us. So there is this kind of class dimension happening in these countries that are forced now, because of political pressure, to show our allegiance and be part of this kind of center, or at least stay as part of in the periphery of the center, to move our resources. But I think it's also important to understand that militarization here also has an impact elsewhere. So militarization here creates a lot of violence in the global south. Even if we don't have war here, the arms drive and the companies that are taking advantage of this huge resources that are being invested into the military, they are benefiting from them elsewhere. So in the context of this campaign, I think the Elbit system is a very good example. They stated that in last year, in autumn, when they invited some Romanian journalists to Israel for a field visit, that they are so glad that they have these factories in Romania, because through them they can access the Security Action for Europe mechanism. And they plan to use this as a way of expansion. And as you know, when we have heard yesterday, this kind of expansion comes with political impunity. So one of the reasons why Israel benefits this kind of political impunity is because of the Israeli arms manufacturers are very embedded within the European military-industrial complex. Of course, they are not Lockheed Martin, they are not Boeing, they are not Raytheon, but they manage to have this kind of specialization in which they have become quite important in certain fields, and they are collaborating a lot, especially with the German companies like Canetta. So I think it's very important to understand this dynamic. As long as we don't have war here, militarization here creates war elsewhere, unfortunately. I think this is important also to reject this kind of instrumentalization of the idea of peace that has, in a way, taken off on the right, especially in Romania, but I think in other countries in Eastern Europe, where we have this kind of populist right-wing parties which are talking about peace, but what they mean actually, they mean some form of stability. I mean, the absence of war here is analogous to peace for them. So it's kind of a negative peace which is only manifested through the absence of open armed conflict. I think it's important to counteract this and try not to play into the discourse. Yeah, we should go and address their voters and their base and prepare an alternative. But I think it should be clear that what we want is kind of positive peace, which means that it's the kind of peace that creates the context in which armed conflict is not necessary or it's not inevitable. So that means that we have social investment, that everybody's needs are taken care of, and that conflict is managed in a way which takes into consideration those that are most affected by it. And this is also a responsibility if we are just a part of this kind of value chain. Because, okay, this is one of the arguments that Romanian politicians and also institutions are making regarding our implication in Gaza. send troops there, we don't arm Israel, everything we send there is offensive. But this is complete nonsense. I mean, it's not quite clear that even though we don't arm them directly, the presence of Israeli companies here contributes to the profit of this company, but also to the larger system that it's producing. I mean, as a colleague from Snoop actually showed last year, and we're really glad they will be here on the next panel. There are arms transfers that are happening, that are going from the factories in Romania to the factories in Israel. So weapons that have been produced here, weapon parts, have been used for sure against the civilians in Gaza. So I think when we try to construct this alternative narrative and discourse about anti-militarization and human security, we need to have this kind of internationalist perspective and actually bring in the discourse the people that are now subjected to it and the people who are also resisting, because I think we also need to make this distinction that there are people who are under attack and they need to respond, and they are now in a situation in which you don't have a choice but to respond militarily. I think, yeah, it's very important to create this kind of discourse that's not idealist, that understand that a big majority of the global south is under direct threat from the west. And yeah, we need to create this kind of solidarity networks with the people that are under actually the bombs. And I think this is also one of the importances of, in a small way, it's also the importance of what we are trying to do with this campaign, because we are trying to, we are connected with people through the BDS movement and through other organizations, with the people that are actually affected by this. And by being aware of this kind of direct connection, you can also create these kind of strategies that, why are they based here? They have international repercussions. I mean, if you listen to the Palestinians, what they are saying is the main thing we need is for you to just stop supporting Israel. It's not, we don't need military intervention from the West, we don't need a war against Israel, we just need, the first step is for every country to just cut its ties. I think it's important to introduce this kind of work, which is like the work of the Western sanctions, in this kind of framework that addresses this anti-militarization. Because it's also from a strategic point of view, it makes a lot of sense. Because for regular people, when you show them this connection, there is this company that's producing here, and these weapons are going to Israel, it becomes a lot more material than just saying that somewhere there are people who are hurting. Because from our experience, a lot of regular people on the streets, they just, also because of the opacity of the press here, and also the fact that the narrative around Gaza was basically taken over from the IDF and the Israeli government, there is little information about what's going on. So I think often people here have no idea about the connections between Romania and Israel. So I think it really helps, especially in the first minute, to have this kind of progressive move where you show that, yeah, there is this company, they are here, this is their chairman, this is the politicians that are supporting them, these are the laws and the Romanian laws and European laws which they are actually breaking while doing this kind of arms transfers. Because these arms transfers are illegal by European legislation. Romania is a partner of the European country, they are subject to the common position of arms exports. And the common position says that if there is a suspicion that weapons might be used against civilians and for war crimes, the licenses shouldn't be awarded. But still it happens, and I think we are now beyond just a suspicion. But I think it makes sense when you try to approach this kind of progressive framework, that you are actually using a discourse that's close to the people, because some of the, I think everyone has here, especially in also elsewhere in the East, have been accused of being puppets for Putin or being apologists for terrorists. But so it makes a lot of sense to actually address it through this kind of legal framework, national legal framework, which is accepted by everyone. And this you can dispel this pity that you're just a foreign intervention within the national landscape. Oh, we are just asking the Romanian state to enforce the laws that are already in place. And of course, we know that the laws are not objective. There is kind of this political substract. There is, of course, the class dimension to them. But I think it's very good, especially when you address people on the street. It really shows the contradiction that lie behind the system. Because if you look at the laws, they're quite good. I mean, we could be living in a world without war if you look just as everybody believes in human rights, everybody believes in peace, and everybody believes that what we produce here is not being used against civilians or workers. Okay.
I'm going to invite Vlad to note by raising their hand if they have any questions for the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you. My question is addressed primarily to Gavin, but I'm glad to hear from other panelists as well. It refers to the opinion that seems to be spreading in the spaces of the Western left, that Trump is trying to create conflict between the East and the West. He mentioned in the national security strategy that the countries of the East are the healthy nations of Europe, and the West is polluted by migration and so on. But it seems to me to be a quite superficial analysis, because I don't really see on any side of the so-called division any real opposition to Trump's policies for the world, and there doesn't seem to be anything like a conflict arising within the imperialist bloc. So I'm wondering how you position yourself towards this type of analysis.
Yeah, I think he is trying to do that, and I think it's the continuation of a long-term strategy of the US, as I mentioned when I was talking. Before the Iraq War, the definition by Donald Rumsfeld of New Europe, Old Europe, trying to make this, that. I mean, remember before the Iraq War, you had it was a quite unique situation in the fact that Germany and France did not support the invasion of Iraq, so there was a division in Europe, and the US tried to highlight this and to structuralize it, I think, in the sense that they see this part of the world as being something which is almost in their sphere of influence. And again, as I mentioned about the black sites and so forth afterwards. I agree with you, but I don't think there is within the European populations this, you have a pro-US East and a pro-European West. I don't think this is the case. I think that perhaps it's the case that they feel they have more influence over some of the leaderships and governments in Eastern Europe. For example, yesterday, Donald Trump said that he would consider moving some of the troops which they are talking about moving out of Germany to Poland. And they say that because the president, and this is sort of almost to quote him, was to say that who he had backed, who's a great guy, as he would say, in his own terms, and he backed in the elections, and that they would consider, therefore, wanting to move some troops to Poland. This could just be rhetoric, you never know with Trump. And remember that the troops leaving Germany is 5,000 from 36,000. It's very much symbolic. But I still think that they see this part of the world as being something they have more influence and control over. I don't think, however, and I probably agree with what was in your question, that there is a strategic divide between European NATO states and the USA. Sometimes you have leaders which talk about as if there is, because it's in their interest. They know that Trump is unpopular. They know that the war against Iran is unpopular. I mean, it's now more unpopular at the beginning of this war than most wars were, you know, when they've ended. And wars tend to get more unpopular the longer they go. So I think some of the European leaders like to say, well, we can no longer trust Trump, laugh at Trump because of his sort of ways. But as I mentioned before, I think they're doing exactly what Donald Trump asks them to do, which is to militarize and to take up the burden of the war in Ukraine and allow the USA to concentrate on other matters. I think this is a division of labour rather than any fundamental divide.
Thank you very much, inspiring words. My question goes to everybody actually, and it's about how we can think about linking the anti-militarization movement to anti-capitalist political visions. What concerns me, so this is the point where things are connected. When you talk about the abolishment of war, actually that means to abolish that financialized military-industrial complex that is very organic part of the capitalist world system. So if we think about abolishing war, we would need to think about destroying capitalism. Then the issue of human security, very much agree with that argument, and I would say that we would need to relearn actually what it was known in the 70s, in the 80s, it was known in the former state socialist system, in East Europe as socialist region. We knew what peaceful coexistence meant, we knew what human security meant. And we all know together, and we see today even more directly how capitalism actually cannot ensure food security, economic security, social security at large for all. It simply cannot. So therefore again, to fight for, to reshape the understanding of security towards human security, we need to make explicit our political options for socialist alternative. And then again, Gavin was talking about how our region, Central and Eastern Europe, will be or is already mostly affected by militarization, being a dependent militarization, as I also talked about yesterday. Maybe it is our role in the region to remind the rest of Europe that there was an alternative to Western Europe and Western capitalism. The alternative was destroyed 35, 36 years ago, but I guess the leftist groups from our region have this responsibility to remind the world about the possibility of alternative and to remind us about the politics of peace of socialist countries, what that meant, right? I wonder if in this sense you see any possibility to connect regional leftist movements anti-capitalist movements for anti-militarization campaign at large. Obviously, we can ask ourselves, Romanians from here in this room, how many of us who are against war and militarization are really part of socialist leftist initiatives, or we shouldn't all be part of it, or we shouldn't think about creating an alliance between our groups exactly on this issue of anti-militarization.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you, and I think that's like building an alternative is not what like I just talked about, but also every day trying to build connections that are outside of capitalism, and like when we talk about everyday resistance, really creating. I mean, from where I'm from, it's maybe like from scratch creating this network of solidarity and of mutual aid that have allow us to really also be prepared and be connected, especially in the cities where there's so much division, there's so much separation. And I don't know, I recently met with some organizers from Minneapolis that are organizing against ICE. And that's different, but also was so inspiring to me to see the level of community organizing that I've been practicing for years and years and years, really at the community level and really creating these networks. And then when ICE started or like increased their actions, are also military actions, how well prepared they were to respond to this. So I think it's also a reflection for us to really try to find this connection and this like construct our life outside of capitalism in everyday ways. It's not easy, but
I sort of agree and I disagree in the question, in the sense of I completely agree capitalism drives the world towards war and the militarization and drive to war will continue, when we live in this imperialist world. I think for a peace movement, though, we shouldn't restrict ourselves to a movement of socialists. That we need to have the broadest possible movement, including different currents. Although I would, just to contradict myself here, I don't think there should be any alliance of extremes, which some people talk about. Alliance with the far right and so forth. This is something which I think we should have no truck with. But as a peace network, then, and as peace movements, we need to, bring in all sorts of different social layers and people who have different political consciousnesses. I remember my first political activity as a teenager was a long time ago in the 1980s, and it was around a campaign in the United Kingdom, around a campaign against nuclear weapons. And the reason I joined it was because I didn't want to die, because I kept there was this belief that there was going to be a nuclear war coming, which wasn't completely unfounded, of course. And the simple emotion of this was that this scared me, and the peace movement seemed to offer an alternative to it. And that very basic emotion, I think, is something that we have to be able to go back to. The other part, however, on this is that I really like the slogan, welfare not warfare. I think this is an excellent slogan. I think linking these things together and showing that it's not just about moving away from war and militarism, but actually investing in things which improve people's lives and so forth. And I think this is something which can have a lot of resonance with people, and by linking these together can also raise people's consciousness, as well as authoritarianism. And you mentioned about ICE and so forth. I think increasingly in this war militarist world, we're having militarist governments and societies, and therefore the connection of authoritarianism, anti-militarism, and pro-welfare. I think these things go together, as a movement. In Eastern Europe, yeah, I mean, I'll sort of repeat what I said, really, but I think this part of the world of Europe is the one which is most under threat, and the peace movement here has to recognise this and also push back again against even parts of the Western left which talk about how we are supporting militarism to protect the people here. There's this ridiculous word I don't know if people have heard of, which at the beginning of the war, West-splaining, which meant that anybody which was talking about anti-war was just telling the people of Eastern Europe what to do, and all of Eastern Europe, of course, what they wanted was more militarisation and so on and so forth. This should be pushed back, and in much, this wasn't so much even West-splaining, it was North-splaining, I think, in many ways, so that when you look at the global South and the left and the global South, they had a far clearer idea of what's happening. And I think this should be something we should be trying to link up more with the progressive and left movements in the global South.
Yeah, I think in general I agree with what Gavin is saying. I think we also need to look a bit at the current context and look at, for example, at the Palestinian solidarity movement. We have been literally tens of millions of people in the streets all over Europe. We didn't manage to even implement the small actions that the movement was requiring from the European state. I mean, except for Spain, Slovenia, and some others, partial arms embargo in Belgium, and at one point, surprisingly, Germany, the gains were quite small. So I think we need to be aware, and these were gains that could happen under a capitalist system. I mean, Spain is still a capitalist country, and still they implement this arms embargo towards Israel. So I think we need to be wary also of our strength as a movement, and not to base our strategy on this kind of giant leaps in consciousness of people, and also of our capacity, because, I mean, let's face it, even in Romania, we are few groups, very few people, so I think we need to take this kind of incremental steps and build. And this is a very good theme because it exposes the contradiction of the capitalist system in a very simple to understand way. It's not very complicated. And this resonates with people, but I think we need to be wary of how far we actually take these themes with regular people on the streets who have been subjected to this anti-communist propaganda for 37 years now. So we need to deconstruct all of this, so I think we should be wary of this kind of, I would say, maybe adventurous.
I think perhaps we have time for one more question, if there is.
Hello, there are many people from outside Romania here. Welcome to this conference, and it's very nice seeing you. The question I'd like to pose is about a subject that I've seen escalating recently, about the federalization of the European Union and how this will squash any gesture like you said Spain or Slovenia or Belgium in cutting ties with Israel. I think the federalization aims at centralizing decision making, so that our activism here on the periphery or in some countries which have more progressive regimes we won't have any capacity to oppose the decisions of the European Commission, because this is what federalization leads to. It happened in other areas of life where countries lost sovereignty and capacity to decide for themselves. But maybe the idea to push for this United States of Europe, or the pro-European camp in all these countries likes to call it, is also about making sure this militarization is unopposed. Because the European Commission is not democratic at all. It's an autocratic regime by all means, by all descriptions. And even some countries like Spain, who surprisingly being the monarchy and the capitalist country, decided to be so progressive in all these wars. They spend very little on NATO. They have good diplomatic ties with Iran. They blocked armed sales to Israel. Or Slovenia, who is talking about a referendum about exiting NATO. All this will disappear if federalization goes ahead. We should be in our activism, in all our groups, parties, societies, aim at fighting this attempt at centralizing decision making at Brussels and at the European Commission alone. Thank you.
I mean, I'm not sure that actually this federalization is a real process. I think if you look at the discussions that are going on at the European Union and see this kind of discussion about the two-speed Europe is again taking hold, I think this kind of federalization is more or less, I mean, the idea and the concept is, I think, a very desperate attempt for the people who are trying to create some kind of legitimacy, especially now in this context where it's still very clear that Europe doesn't have a singular voice. And I think it's impossible to have a singular voice because there are conflicting interests even between the poles, like between French and Germany, and also the UK. Okay, it's not part of the EU, but it's still there. So I understand what you're saying. I agree with the idea that this kind of federalization, especially in the way that the European Union is structured now, will basically mean the loss of sovereignty, especially for countries on the periphery and the countries that are part of the second speed Europe. But I don't think that this is very likely to happen.
Yeah, well, very quickly, I agree with what you're saying there, and obviously the pressure, the push is for democratisation within the European Union as well, which again I agree with you on the European Commission and so forth. I don't think the big threat at the moment is federalisation, although the undemocratic nature of the EU and its decision making is obviously a serious thing. Just on the flip point as well is this idea that if we leave the European Union, we start breaking up the European Union, you can have a more progressive policy. Look at Brexit, look what happens in this. This doesn't lead to a more progressive, anti-militarist political agenda. This actually places the United Kingdom more under the influence and the control of the United States. We're in a very difficult situation of that, but even, breaking up the EU as an alternative also isn't an option.
Thank you all for your participation. Thank you all for such an interesting discussion. Before we leave, I just wanted to allow myself to do a brief moment of advocacy. The work that we do with the Elbit Out campaign is very much dependent on the contribution of everyone and anyone. And so if you're in a position where you can maybe spread the message, or if you're in a position whether to perhaps donate, then there's an information desk there. If you are a resident of Romania and you haven't signed the campaign yet, then that'd be great if you could sign the petition. We're about to submit the signatures next week. And on that note, thank you all for being here. There are going to be 2 additional panels happening. One is going to be on accountability in action, the role of journalism in advancing justice, and I think that's going to be happening here. And then in the adjacent room, we're going to have a panel on Eastern Europe solidarity with the Palestinian struggle. It'd be great to see